They told you soul food was just fried chicken and mac and cheese, but they never told you about the oxtails simmered for hours on Sunday afternoon. Some of these dishes were passed down quietly, without cookbooks, because for generations, black families weren't just cooking, they were preserving survival in secret. These recipes are living pieces of African American history, rich, resourceful, and hidden in plain sight. And once you taste them, you'll wonder why no one told you sooner. 1. Smothered pork chops. This dish is a hallmark of Southern black cooking, not just for its flavor, but for what it represented, turning modest ingredients into something luxurious. During the Great Migration, many black families brought with them the practice of stretching ingredients to feed large households. Pork chops were often considered a treat, especially bone-in cuts that could be bought cheaply at the butcher or bartered for at community markets. The technique was brilliant in its simplicity. First, the chops were seasoned with salt, black pepper, paprika, garlic powder, and maybe a pinch of cayenne. Dredged in flour and fried until golden, then removed while the pan was still sizzling. Into that same skillet went sliced onions, sometimes green bell peppers, deglazed with broth or water, and thickened into a rich golden brown gravy. But the magic? That came in the smothering. The pork chops were returned to the skillet, submerged in the gravy, and slow-cooked on low for up to an hour. It made the meat fall apart tender and infused it with a depth of flavor that no seasoning packet could match. Served with white rice, cabbage, or buttery mashed potatoes, this dish fed the body. But more importantly, it told the story of generations who turned scraps into soul. 2. Collard greens with smoked turkey necks. Long before health blogs praised leafy greens, black families were simmering pots of collards as both sustenance and celebration. This recipe traces its roots back to West Africa, where leafy greens were essential to daily diets and often boiled with spices and meats. In the American South, collards became more than a side dish. They were cultural staples, served during Sunday dinners, funerals, family reunions, and especially on New Year's Day, when greens symbolized money and prosperity. Traditionally, collards were cooked with ham hocks, fatback, or neck bones. But in more health-conscious generations, smoked turkey necks became the protein of choice, offering that same smoky, salty depth without the excess fat. The greens were soaked and rinsed several times. Any true Southern cook will tell you grit has no place in a pot of greens. Then chopped and added to a large stock pot filled with turkey necks, onions, garlic, red pepper flakes, vinegar, and sometimes a splash of hot sauce. They were simmered for hours, not minutes, until the greens became tender and dark, soaking up the broth known affectionately as pot liquor. That broth alone could nourish you. Elders would sop it up with cornbread or save it for sipping. Collard greens weren't just food, they were medicine, memory, and tradition passed through the hands of women who remembered slavery only one generation removed. 3. Sweet potato pie. No Thanksgiving table in a black household was complete without sweet potato pie, and it was more than dessert. It was the signature of the matriarch. In many families, only one person made the pie, and it wasn't up for debate. You didn't just make sweet potato pie, you inherited it. Brought over from West Africa, sweet potatoes were a staple of the transatlantic foodways. Unlike pumpkin pie, which dominated white American kitchens, sweet potato pie used ingredients readily available in the South and reflected African American flavor preferences: warm, spiced, comforting. The sweet potatoes were roasted, never boiled. Roasting concentrated the sugars, mashed smooth, then mixed with eggs, evaporated milk, brown sugar, vanilla, nutmeg, cinnamon, and just a hint of lemon or orange zest. The crust could be homemade or store-bought, but it had to be buttery and flaky. No shortcuts. Some pies were topped with marshmallows or pecan crumbles in newer generations, but traditionally the top was left plain, glossy from the egg and sugar blend. The first slice always went to the elder, and no one dared ask for seconds until everyone had been served. It wasn't just pie, it was praise, legacy, and love served cold the next morning with coffee and stories from the past. 4. Fried catfish. If there was ever a unifier at black family reunions, it was the fish fry. And no fish was more beloved or more deeply rooted in African American culinary tradition than fried catfish. Catfish was abundant in southern rivers and creeks, cheap to catch and hard to overcook, making it the perfect protein for families trying to stretch a dollar while still making something delicious. Fried catfish was more than a meal. It was an event. Families would gather outside with picnic tables, aluminum pans, gallon jugs of sweet tea, and tubs of cornmeal. The fish was often marinated briefly in buttermilk, which tenderized the flesh and reduced the muddy flavor catfish sometimes carried. Then it was dredged in a seasoned cornmeal blend, usually mixed with cayenne, garlic powder, and a bit of paprika. Dropped into hot peanut oil, the fillets would bubble and crisp, forming a golden shell that snapped with each bite. It was served with hot sauce, always Crystal or Louisiana brand, a slice of white bread, and maybe a side of coleslaw or baked beans. Some added lemon wedges, others a tartar sauce their auntie swore by. And the leftovers? Eaten cold on white bread the next day with mustard. Fried catfish is a dish that turned survival into celebration, a taste of community, wrapped in paper towels, shared by hand. 5. Hoppin' John. This dish carries African spiritual symbolism and Southern practicality in every spoonful. A mix of black-eyed peas, rice, and pork, often bacon or ham hock. Hoppin' John was a dish of luck, legacy, and nourishment. It's believed to have roots in Senegalese and Gula food traditions, where rice and beans were already dietary staples. In the antebellum South, enslaved Africans adapted these traditions using the ingredients available on plantations: black-eyed peas grown in gardens, rice from the Carolina coast, and pork scraps from the kitchen. Hoppin' John was eaten on New Year's Day for good luck, with the peas symbolizing coins and greens, served alongside, representing paper money. But it wasn't just a holiday meal, it was everyday ingenuity. The rice and peas stretched to feed large families, and the pork added just enough richness to keep spirits high, even when pockets were empty. Seasonings varied by region, but almost always included onion, garlic, and bay leaf. Some added vinegar, hot sauce, or smoked paprika for depth. Leftovers were never discarded. Instead, they were reincarnated the next day as Skippin' Jenny, a sign of frugality, which, in itself, was a virtue to be celebrated. 6. Hoe cakes. At first glance, they look like simple cornmeal pancakes, but hoe cakes carry a name and a legacy that speaks volumes about black survival, labor, and invention. The term hoe cake comes from the method once used to cook them. Field workers, often enslaved, would place the batter on the flat side of a hoe and cook it over an open flame in the fields. When there was no stove, no skillet, no luxury, just grit and fire, this humble cake kept people going. Made from cornmeal, water, salt, and sometimes lard or bacon grease, hoe cakes were economical and filling. As the generations moved from the plantation fields to freed households, the recipe stayed, but it evolved. Some versions added buttermilk or eggs, making them fluffier and more tender. In rural southern kitchens, hoe cakes were often served alongside greens, beans, or stews, used like bread to scoop up the juices. They were passed down without fanfare. You didn't see them in cookbooks, but you'd see them on iron griddles in the morning, crisping at the edges and golden in the middle, served hot with butter, honey, or syrup. Hoe cakes weren't just breakfast. They were proof that even with the barest means, black hands could create something warm, nourishing, and deeply rooted in tradition. 7. Ham hocks and lima beans. This dish is a perfect example of culinary alchemy, transforming the least desirable ingredients into a pot of gold. Ham hocks, the joint between the foot and leg of the pig, were rarely eaten by the wealthy. But for African Americans, especially during the Jim Crow era, these discarded cuts became treasure. Smoked and slow-cooked, a ham hock could infuse a pot of beans with a depth of flavor that no seasoning blend could match. Lima beans, introduced to the Americas through indigenous and African agricultural exchange, were a cheap and filling staple in black communities. When simmered low and slow with ham hocks, onions, garlic, and pepper, they absorbed every bit of the smoky broth. The beans would soften to a creamy texture, making every bite rich and savory. This dish wasn't fancy. It wasn't served at banquets. But in black households, especially during the 1940s to 60s, it was a weeknight miracle, stretching leftovers into a full meal. Children often remembered the rhythmic bubbling sound coming from the stove and the smell that clung to the air long after dinner ended. Leftovers were even better the next day, served over rice or sopped up with cornbread. To this day, some elders still say, "If you know how to season beans right, you'll never go hungry." 8. Gullah red rice. If soul food had an anthem, Gullah red rice might be the heartbeat. Born from the rich coastal cultures of South Carolina and Georgia, this dish was a spiritual cousin to West African jollof rice. The Gullah Geechee people, descendants of enslaved Africans who lived in relative isolation on the Sea Islands, preserved more African customs, language, and culinary tradition than almost any other black American group. Red rice wasn't just a side, it was a cultural bridge. The dish starts with long-grain rice sautéed in bacon fat or oil with onions, bell peppers, garlic, and crushed tomatoes. Spices like thyme, cayenne, and sometimes celery seed give it boldness. Smoked sausage, chicken gizzards, or shrimp were often added if they were available. But even without meat, the dish was rich, tangy, and deeply satisfying. In Gullah homes, red rice was often cooked for Sunday dinners, birthdays, or church potlucks. The tomato base symbolized wealth and blessing. Some elders would say that if your red rice came out too dry or too mushy, you weren't paying attention because this dish demanded care. You had to feel it. In the 21st century, Gullah red rice is finally getting the recognition it deserves, but in truth, it never disappeared. It just stayed close to the heart, passed down quietly by those who never forgot where they came from. 9. Chicken and dumplings. This dish was born out of necessity but perfected through care. In many black households, especially during the Depression and wartime eras, a single chicken had to stretch. Chicken and dumplings was how mothers and grandmothers made it happen. First, a whole chicken was boiled with onion, celery, garlic, bay leaf, and black pepper until tender. The meat was pulled from the bones and returned to the pot. The broth, already rich from fat and flavor, became the base for the dumplings, a mix of flour, fat, usually shortening or lard, and a bit of milk or water. Rolled thin and cut into strips or rounds, the dumplings were added to the pot and simmered until soft but firm. Some families preferred slick dumplings, wide and flat. Others liked them puffed up and biscuit-like. No matter the shape, the result was the same: warm, filling, and deeply comforting. This wasn't restaurant food, it was grief food, cold weather food, celebration food, food that wrapped around the soul. Eaten with a big spoon and a bigger smile, chicken and dumplings wasn't about luxury. It was about making sure everyone at the table had something hot, hearty, and made with love. 10. Molasses gingerbread. Before white sugar became widely available or affordable, black families used molasses as the sweetener of choice. It was cheaper, more robust in flavor, and it gave gingerbread a deep, almost smoky sweetness that white sugar never could. This gingerbread wasn't the light, fluffy kind seen in suburban cookbooks. It was dense, moist, and spiced with intention. Ginger, cloves, cinnamon, and allspice dancing together in every bite. It was often baked in cast-iron pans or old metal trays that had seasoned flavors baked into them. Families made it during fall and winter holidays, especially when guests were expected. It paired beautifully with black coffee or buttermilk, and the leftovers rarely lasted more than a day. For many elders, this was the first dessert they learned to make, handed down without a recipe card. "You'll know it's right when the batter hugs the spoon," one grandmother told her granddaughter. Today, few people realize just how far back this cake goes. It's not just dessert, it's a direct line to a time when sweetness had to be earned and every ingredient was precious. 11. Oxtail stew. Once dismissed as scraps, oxtails were the kind of cut left for the poor, too fatty, too bony, too tough. But in African-American kitchens, they were transformed into rich, luxurious stews that rivaled any fine dining roast. This dish is a culinary reversal in its purest form. What others threw away, black cooks elevated into legacy. The oxtails were first seared until caramelized, then braised slowly in a base of onions, garlic, tomato paste, Worcestershire sauce, and broth, sometimes flavored with allspice, thyme, bay leaves, or Scotch bonnet peppers, if Caribbean influence was present. The meat would cook for hours until it slid off the bone and the marrow melted into the sauce, thickening it with natural richness. The stew was often served over rice or buttered noodles, and it wasn't a weeknight dinner. It was a Sunday dish, a show of effort and love. And when the pot hit the table, silence followed, the kind that meant reverence, not absence. Oxtail stew was a reminder that even in a world that handed you bones, you could still make something unforgettable. 12. Chitlins, chitterlings. For many, the mere mention of chitlins stirs a visceral reaction, and that's part of their power. Chitlins, made from pig intestines, are a deeply polarizing food, even within black communities. But behind the controversy lies a story of ingenuity, resilience, and sometimes trauma. And that's why they still matter. During slavery, enslaved Africans were given the least desirable parts of butchered animals: feet, ears, tails, and intestines. Chitlins were cleaned thoroughly, sometimes taking hours, then slow-boiled with vinegar, onions, garlic, and spices to reduce odor and tenderize the meat. The process was intense and sacred. In many homes, there was a chitlin queen, the one elder who had the patience and skill to prepare them correctly. For decades, chitlins were served during holidays or special occasions, particularly in the South. They were a delicacy born of deprivation. Eating chitlins today is an act of cultural continuity, an emotional breadcrumb that connects the table to the field, the present to a past that is hard to digest, but necessary to remember. 13. Candied yams. Candied yams were never just a side dish. They were a sugary, sticky crown jewel of any holiday spread. And despite their name, most didn't use actual yams, but sweet potatoes, a crop with deep African roots. In West Africa, yams were central to ceremonial meals, and enslaved Africans preserved that tradition in the New World using sweet potatoes instead. The preparation was as thoughtful as it was indulgent. Thick rounds of sweet potato were layered in a buttered baking dish, then drenched in brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and melted butter. Some cooks added orange juice, vanilla, or even a splash of bourbon. Then they were baked, not just until soft, but until the syrup thickened and caramelized at the edges. What made this dish special wasn't just its taste, it was its timing. Candied yams were almost always made in advance, which meant the smell teased you for hours before dinner. And once on the plate, they always touched something: the greens, the stuffing, the turkey, blending sweet with savory in a uniquely soulful way. They weren't dessert, they were memory, the kind of memory that made your plate full even before you took a bite. 14. Red drink. You'd see it before you'd ask. At every family reunion, church picnic, or Juneteenth celebration, a tall pitcher or punch bowl filled with something red. Not cherry, not strawberry, just red. Red drink. While it might seem like a casual beverage, red drink carries symbolic weight in African American culture. Its roots trace back to West African hibiscus teas like bissap or zobo, bright red herbal drinks used in ceremonies and community gatherings. During slavery and afterward, those traditions were adapted into sweetened red beverages made with Kool-Aid, red soda, or fruit punches. And while the ingredients varied, the color remained sacred. Why red? Some say it symbolized the bloodshed in the fight for freedom. Others say it simply represented joy, the kind of joy you had to make for yourself when nothing else was sweet. No recipe was universal. Some families added pineapple juice or lemon-lime soda. Others steeped hibiscus flowers or used cranberry concentrate. But one thing was consistent. It was cold, it was bright, and it was made to be shared. Red drink wasn't just a thirst quencher. It was the unofficial flag of a culture that knew how to celebrate, even in struggle. 15. Grits with cheese and butter. Before breakfast bowls became trendy, there was a humble pot of grits on nearly every black kitchen stove in the South. Coarse ground corn simmered with patience and care, stirred slowly to avoid lumps, seasoned lightly with salt, and finished with generous amounts of butter and sometimes shredded cheddar, giving it body and depth. Grits weren't expensive, but they were sacred. They were the first thing you tasted in the morning and the last thing served to guests at the table. Paired with fried eggs, sausage, or just eaten plain, grits filled you up and warmed you from the inside out. But here's the twist. Grits weren't just breakfast food. They were dinner, too. Shrimp and grits, for example, originated as a simple fisherman's meal along the South Carolina coast. In some households, leftover grits were poured into pans to set overnight, then sliced and fried crisp the next day. Nothing wasted. Everything used. And for children who grew up in those kitchens, the sound of the spoon scraping the bottom of the pot was the signal that breakfast and the day had officially begun. 16. Peach cobbler. Peach cobbler isn't just dessert, it's a warm embrace from history. The story of this dish begins in the kitchens of the Deep South, where African-American cooks transformed seasonal fruit and humble pantry staples into acts of love. When fresh peaches were available in summer, families would pick them by the bushel, from backyard trees, roadside stands, or farms where they worked. Sugar was precious, flour was rationed during wartime, but somehow there was always enough to make cobbler. The cobbled crust was more rustic than pie, sometimes spooned over like dumplings, other times carefully rolled into golden perfection. Seasoned with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a touch of lemon juice to brighten the sweetness, the cobbler would bubble in a cast-iron pan until the fruit caramelized around the edges. You could hear it hiss as it cooled. Peach cobbler was served hot, often with a melting scoop of ice cream or just a splash of cold cream. But more than anything, it was ceremonial. Made for Sunday dinners, homecomings, repasts, and even first dates, a way of saying, "You are home now." For many, the memory of that golden crust and syrupy filling lives longer than the recipe itself. And the best part? The corner piece, always a little more crust, always claimed by the eldest at the table. 17. Neckbone soup. This dish is a masterclass in thrift, flavor, and storytelling. Neckbones, often overlooked and undervalued, were once the cuts that white butchers tossed aside. But black cooks knew better. They understood that flavor lived in the bone, and that the long, slow simmer of a pot of neckbone soup could turn poverty into poetry. The recipe varied by region. Some added potatoes, carrots, and celery. Others used cabbage, beans, or corn. What remained constant was the method: browning the bones first, then simmering them with aromatics until the broth became rich and silky. The meat would eventually pull off the bone in soft, tender ribbons. Spices were simple: salt, pepper, garlic, maybe bay leaf. But the flavor was profound. In many families, this was a weekday dinner, quiet, unfussy, and deeply nourishing. For elders raised during the Great Depression or in post-war cities, neckbone soup was a reminder that making do didn't mean giving up flavor. It meant honoring every piece of the animal, every drop of labor. In some homes, children were taught to save the neck bones for hard times, but in truth, this dish was made whenever you needed comfort. 18. Black-eyed pea fritters. aka akara. Before canned beans filled grocery store shelves, African American families made fresh black-eyed peas by soaking, peeling, and grinding them by hand. The result? Akara, also known as black-eyed pea fritters. This dish has deep West African roots, particularly in Senegal, where similar fritters were, and still are, served street-side with spicy sauces and bread. In the South, these fritters evolved into a beloved appetizer or side, especially in coastal regions with strong Gullah influence. The beans were blended into a paste with onion, garlic, and salt, then deep-fried into crispy, golden rounds. The outside was crunchy, the inside soft and airy. Some versions included chopped peppers or scallions. They were often served with a dipping sauce, sometimes hot sauce, other times a tangy relish. Akara was more than just a snack. It was a cultural handshake between continents, a tangible reminder that African foodways endured even when names and languages were stripped away. Eating them today is like time traveling with taste. One bite, and suddenly you're connected to something older, deeper, and beautifully unbroken. 19. Baked macaroni and cheese, the real one. Forget the boxed version. In Black American households, baked mac and cheese was not a quick fix. It was an art form, often reserved for holidays, Sunday dinners, or special guests. It wasn't just about pasta and cheese. It was about structure, richness, and love layered between elbow macaroni. The key was the cheese sauce, a roux of butter and flour, slowly blended with milk and infused with sharp cheddar, Colby, or even Velveeta, depending on the cook. The mixture was folded with cooked macaroni, layered in a buttered baking dish, and topped with more cheese or breadcrumbs. Some families added eggs for firmness. Others used evaporated milk to make it custardy. Then came the baking. No stovetop shortcuts. The goal was a creamy interior with a slightly crispy golden top, and a smell that pulled people from across the house. There was an unspoken rule. Only one person made the mac and cheese at any gathering. That honor was earned, not assigned. And if you took the last corner piece, the one with the crispy cheese crust, you better pray there was another pan because Auntie was watching. 20. Buttermilk biscuits. If sweet potato pie was legacy and greens were wisdom, then buttermilk biscuits were daily grace. In African American kitchens, biscuits were made at sunrise, before school, before church, before anyone else was even awake. They were made from scratch, without measuring cups, just hands, memory, and feel. Flour, baking powder, salt, cold lard or butter, and tangy buttermilk, folded gently but never overworked. Rolled out and cut with drinking glasses, baked until golden, split open, and filled with whatever was on hand, jam, sausage, eggs, or just butter. The texture? Soft on the inside, flaky on the outside, with a bottom that crisped on cast iron like it had been kissed by fire. These biscuits were used to mop up gravy, sandwich leftover meat, or simply comfort a child after a bad day. Some were dropped by spoon, others rolled into perfect rounds. And when you saw that biscuit tin come out, usually dented, maybe wrapped in a kitchen towel, you knew something sacred was about to be served. In truth, no one made them quite like Grandma, and even if you followed her steps exactly, yours would still taste different, because the secret ingredient wasn't technique, it was time. 21. Sorghum syrup on everything. Before maple syrup found its way into supermarkets, and long before corn syrup flooded American tables, there was sorghum. This dark, rich, and slightly bitter syrup was once a staple sweetener in rural black households across the South.